Hi guys, it is Sam and I am here today to talk about non-fiction books. So not too long ago I was talking with Nikki over at Nikki Lives Now about how non-fiction books aren't that prevalent on Booktube, and we both like to read non-fiction books, and so I decided to kind of do a video discussing non-fiction books. So non-fiction books that I have read that I loved, books that I'm currently reading, books I want to read, just why I like to read non-fiction, and just kind of share it with you guys and hopefully inspire some of you guys to pick up a non-fiction book yourself, and just to have an overall discussion about non-fiction books. So most of the non-fiction books that I read have to do with history because I absolutely love history, especially ancient and medieval history. I just find it interesting to see how people lived, what happened, what went on, just to sort of imagine what life was like back then and to think about what people had to live through and what they might have seen and heard and how they would have talked and how they would have lived. It just fascinates me and I find it interesting. I seriously wish that the TARDIS was real and the Doctor was real, because if he asked me where I wanted to go, my first destination would be to go back in time somewhere like ancient Egypt or medieval Europe and just to see for myself how people lived. I think that would be so cool to be able to see it and live it and just, see what it was like. So that's why I like to read history books. It just gives me a little piece of what it might have been like back then, and to learn about it and learn about events that happened, because it's all of our history. It's human history. It's a part of us and our ancestry. No matter where you're at, who you are, we're all connected by a common shared history, and I find it interesting and fascinating. So I like to learn about it, and I learn about it by reading nonfiction books. And yes, it might seem a little bit boring, and I don't recommend reading a nonfiction book like cover to cover right away like you would a fiction book. I tend to have to read a nonfiction book along with a fiction book. So I'll kind of, read a chapter here or there. I don't just sit down and read a whole book cover to cover, because for me, even though I find it interesting, it still gets a little bit dull. So I mix it up with some other books and I read a chapter here or there, and I enjoy it. I enjoy learning new things and experiencing other cultures through their history. I do want to start branching into other types of nonfiction books. I would like to start reading maybe some more autobiographies or biographies of famous people and historical figures. I think that would be very interesting to read. I would just sort of like to branch out aside from history books, I guess, which I hope to get into more so as the years go by. But first I will show you guys some nonfiction books that I personally like, and most of them are going to be dealing with history because that's mostly what I read when I read a nonfiction book, but these are some of my favorites and some of the ones that I find the most interesting. The first book I have to show you guys is The Life of Charlemagne by Einhard. I read this as part of a medieval studies class I took while I was in college, and I found it really interesting. This was written by a monk who lived with Charlemagne, who was at his court and conversed with him, spoke with him, and basically admired him to a certain extent. You are able to read about one of the most famous kings of the Dark Ages, and really one of the most progressive kings for the age in which he lived, by somebody who actually lived with him and spoke with him and saw him, and I find that so interesting. It's really, really small, as you can see, and it's even big print. It's been translated as it's for class, in case you can't tell by the highlighting. It was translated into a modern English, so it is easy to read, and it's just really interesting to get this perspective on a historical figure from somebody that actually lived, talked with him. Guys, it's really, really fascinating, trust me. The next two books I have to tell you guys about are Terry Jones' Medieval Lives and Ian Mortimer's The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England. I have both of these on my Kindle, and I found them so interesting, especially Medieval Lives, because it was written kind of humorously, which I really appreciated. It made it easy to read. I think that one I actually read cover to cover just because it was so entertaining and fascinating. And the reason why I like both of these books is that they're not just dealing with medieval history, they are dealing with how people lived during the Middle Ages. So what they wore, what they ate, what they did for fun, how they would have talked, what their houses would have looked like, dealing with some of the common misconceptions surrounding the Dark Ages, such as it was a time, not a time of learning or progress in terms of science, which isn't true. There's actually a lot discovered and used back then that we still use today, and it was just entertaining and fascinating to see how people lived during that time, not so much the events that took place during that time. And so both of those books are really, really good, and I really recommend them. Another book that I love is also my Kindle is 101 Things You Didn't Know About Irish History. So anybody that knows me knows that I love everything to do with Ireland. It's a part of my heritage I identify with the most, and I just love studying the history. I love studying the culture. I love basically just reading everything about Irish and Ireland and Irish history. I love the music and just all that stuff. So I really, really enjoyed this book. It was actually a pretty quick read. This was another one that I did actually read cover to cover. It's just like a quick little read. It tells you some interesting facts about Ireland that I found really interesting. They're not very big. The paragraphs are pretty small. Each chapter is not that big, but it's concise and it gives you a lot of information, which I really, really enjoyed about this book. Another book that I found interesting was Daily Life in Victorian London. And this book is really, really interesting. It is a bunch of excerpts from people's diaries, journals, newspaper articles, and various other sources of writing that came from the Victorian era. And it's just an insight into how people lived, talked, what they thought during that time period. Hearing these words from people who walked, talked, spoke, lived during this time period and their perspective on what was going on during then, and just to see how the culture has changed and in some ways how it hasn't changed. And I actually really, one of my favorite chapters in here had to do with Christmas, because again, anybody who knows me knows that I love Christmas. It's my absolute favorite time of the year. And they were just talking about how the shops look during Christmas time and some of the things they did during Christmas. And just to see that cultural perspective from somebody who lived during that time was just so cool, and I loved it. And I wanted to be there because it seemed so nice and lovely. Another nonfiction book that I really enjoyed, and I actually haven't read all the way through. I've been meaning to read the whole thing, but I haven't, just kind of stopped. But that is Castles and Palaces and Stately Homes of Britain and Ireland. This book is so cool. It has tons of different castles and homes from the UK, and it gives a little history on them, and there's tons of pictures and what they look like inside and outside, and it is just such a cool book. As you can see, there's lots and lots of pictures. And it's just really interesting to have that and to have the pictures there and to feel like you're there. I just love books like these and looking at the pictures and reading the history, and I just imagine, you know, like this castle, somebody, what were the people like that lived there? What did they think? What did they speak? Were they happy? Were they sad? Who were the people that built it? Where did they end up? Would they have good lives? I don't know. There's just some of the things I think about when I read a history book. I just find it so interesting to just know a little bit of what it was like back then, and to see and just to wonder and imagine what the people were like that lived here. And nonfiction books can be about anything that you love. For instance, The Legend of Zelda, Hyrule Historia. Again, this is one that I haven't quite finished yet, but it is chock full of the history of Zelda and just full of pictures and images of how they designed it. And it's a nonfiction book, but it's about something I love, Zelda and video games. And it's interesting just to see how everything worked out, what inspired them to create some of the characters, and just to have this whole back history on something that I love. And you can get that in nonfiction books. You can just learn more about your favorite things. Same thing with my Doctor Who The Vault book. It's a piece of nonfiction, but I learned so much more about Doctor Who than I didn't even know I knew. I thought I knew a lot about Doctor Who, and then I read this one, and I have a whole bunch more information about the whole 50 years of the show that I never knew. And it's full of original scripts and artist renderings of sets and monsters and things, such as that guy. And I just find it interesting, and you can learn so much more, and I feel like I'm so much more invested in the show when I learn more about it. And it's nice to have that history, and you can get that from the nonfiction books. They're not all created equal. They can be quite fascinating. Now moving on to some of the books that I hope to read that are pieces of nonfiction. I want to read this guy cover to cover. It is a history of the Middle Ages. This was actually my textbook for my medieval studies class I took in college, but we only read a couple of chapters of it. We didn't read all of it, and it was actually pretty easy to read for a textbook. I found it really interesting, the parts that we did read, and I want to finish it cover to cover. I have read, of course, history books on medieval Ireland and such, but in little excerpts from different books about the Middle Ages, but to have this overall history of the entire world during the Middle Ages, because this deals not only with Europe, but also with the Middle East and Africa and Asia, and I just find it interesting, and I want to read and know more about it and have a full perspective on this period. Another book I want to read is Harold the Last of the Saxon Kings. It is a book about Harold, who was the king of the Saxons, Britons, who lost the Battle of Hastings in 1066 to William the Conqueror. It's a book about what he was like, what he accomplished, what his rule was like, and I would find that interesting to read. Another work of nonfiction that is on my radar is Hyperbole and a Half by Ali Brosh. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her blog. She posts a lot of different blog posts about things that have happened to her in her life, different situations, and you know, just life stuff. And she has it compiled in the book with some new stories that aren't on her blog, and I really want to read it. Her writing is humorous, her stories are humorous, if not sometimes sad, and I just want to read it, and it's a piece of nonfiction, but it's entertaining. So there's just a couple of the books that I have on my radar to read that are pieces of nonfiction. Like I said, I'm hoping to get more into like biographies and autobiographies and that sort of thing sometime in the future. But I just wanted to do this video, guys, to show you that nonfiction books can be as interesting as works of fiction. You just have to know what to look for and to find something that isn't as bland as you might think, and to know that you can read it and still enjoy it. Just don't force yourself to read it. Just read chapters here and there when you're in the mood, and then continue on with whatever novel you happen to be reading. But I hope this video helped you guys, and I hope it will inspire some of you to pick up a nonfiction book, because like I said, again, they can be just as entertaining as pieces of fiction. So let me know down in the comments if you guys like to read nonfiction books and what those books are, because I would love to check them out, because I'm always looking for new good works of nonfiction. And also let me know if this video helps you and if there's anything else you were curious to know about nonfiction, and I will maybe make another video or try and help you out in the comments. Just let me know, just throw it down there. And if you guys liked, please thumbs up and subscribe. And until next time, guys, happy reading. Bye!